Hello, 5th graders, and welcome to a read-aloud of today's ELA story titled The Most Famous Woman in America. From Clara Barton, founder of the American Red Cross, by Augusta Stevenson. And the subject of our reading today is this woman here, Clara Barton, founder of the American Red Cross. The Most Famous Woman in America. One night in 1867, a large hall in Washington, D.C. was crowded with people. The greatest of American war nurses was to speak, Miss Clara Barton. She had nursed sick and wounded soldiers in the Civil War of 1861 to 1865, and she had been right up at the front, too. She was always in danger. Sometimes she was under enemy fire. Miss Barton was now the most famous woman in America. She had done the greatest things for wounded soldiers that had ever been done by anyone in the United States. She had found a way to save lives. She hadn't liked the way the Army took care of the wounded. She said their hospitals were splendid, but too far from the battlefields. Many men died on the way before they received treatment. Miss Barton said they should be treated at the front as soon as they could be carried off the field. Her plan had been adopted. Aid stations were now set up near every battlefield. Thousands of soldiers had been saved by them. Their families were grateful to Miss Barton. The whole nation was grateful. People loved the sound of her name. Tonight, a group of young nurses was in a box to the left of the stage. "Just imagine," exclaimed one. "Clara Barton was the first woman nurse to go to the battlefield, the very first in America." "She had a hard time getting permission," said another. "General after general refused. They said it was no place for a woman." "But that didn't stop Clara," said the third, smiling. "She went to other generals, army doctors, chaplains, quartermasters, colonels, and captains. She went to everyone she knew and everyone her friends knew. Finally, she succeeded. She obtained permission to join the Army of the Potomac in 1862. "Hurrah!" cried one, and all the white caps nodded. "How could she do that?" asked a new nurse. "I thought she was timid." The nurse from Massachusetts answered, "She was. She still is. Her relatives say that she dreads those lectures." "Why is she speaking, then?" "To get more help for sick and wounded soldiers. She is devoting all her time and energy to this. She has spoken in all the large cities in the East, and she is still lecturing to large crowds." The new nurse shook her head. "How can she be a good speaker if she is so bashful?" "Her relatives say she forgets herself when she begins to talk about the needs of soldiers. She becomes another person, with the courage to face any audience anywhere. Just wait, you'll see what I mean. You'll love her." "I love her anyway," said the new nurse. "I think she is wonderful." Again, white caps nodded in agreement. They all thought Clara Barton was wonderful. In the next box was a group of young soldiers. All carried canes or crutches. "I'm glad I'll get to see Nurse Barton again," said one. "She saved my life in the Battle of Cedar Mountain." "She saved me too," said another. "I had been wounded for a long time. The orderlies wouldn't have found me if I hadn't been for her lanterns. She brought them in her supply wagon." "They wouldn't have found a good many of us," said a third. "There weren't any candles or lanterns in our camp. Our supply wagon hadn't come up." "I don't see how Nurse Barton could get her wagon up to the front with her supplies," said a fourth. "There's a lot of difference between a single 4-mule wagon and a train of them 4 or 5 miles long." "That's true, Lucian. Anyway, an angel from heaven couldn't have been more welcome. We were starving, and she brought food." "Do you remember the corn husks our doctors were using for bandages?" asked Will. "And do you remember the rolls of soft white bandages that Miss Barton brought?" The others nodded and smiled. "She was a real manager," said Joe. "In about 3 minutes, she had things moving. She had fires made, kettles swung, water boiling, and food unpacked in no time at all," said another soldier. "And she herself was making gruel," said Lucian. "Talk about angels from heaven." "In more ways than you can count," added James. "She wanted to live the way we boys lived. She didn't want comforts we couldn't have." "That's a fact," agreed Joe. "I know she refused a carpet someone offered her for her tent. She said soldiers were sleeping on the ground." "She wouldn't take anything but a soldier's pay," said Robert. "She told me that herself." "If she said it, it's true," declared Lucian. The others nodded gravely. Across the hall, in a box to the right, there were 4 army doctors and surgeons who knew her well. All of them had worked with Nurse Barton at the front. "She was the bravest woman I ever saw," said one. "She helped me at the Battle of Antietam," said another. "We were so close to the front that our faces were black with the smoke of powder." "She waited in the mud at Falmouth," said the third. She was helping the orderlies look for wounded men. Clara Barton never ran away from anything she thought was her duty, declared the fourth. No, never, agreed the others. In an adjoining box were 4 Army officers. Miss Barton had worked in their camps. All of them knew her well. I've often thought of her narrow escapes, said a general. She was often under enemy fire. Once her skirt was riddled with bullets when she was crossing a bridge that was being shelled. She never seemed to be afraid. And such a bridge, exclaimed a major. It was just small boats close together and rocking with the strong current. It's a wonder she didn't fall into the river. The captain smiled. She told me afterward she had practiced for this when she was a girl. She learned to cross a river on teetering logs. It was a good thing she learned to ride horseback when she was young, said a colonel. One day we had to ride at breakneck speed to escape from the enemy. She kept up with us. It looks as if she had been getting ready for this war all her life, said the general. She was an athlete from at the time she was 13. That's the reason she was able to stand the hardships of war, said the colonel. A weaker woman wouldn't have lasted a day. Now all talking stopped, for the meeting began. The Reverend William Fisher came to the stage. He had charge of the meeting. He was followed by a lady. She was small, and she had dark eyes and hair. Her face was pleasant and kind. The instant she appeared, there was a thunder of applause. The large audience rose to its feet, and 1,000 voices called, "Miss Barton! Miss Barton!" The little lady bowed, smiled, and waved her hand. The applause went on and on. Miss Barton waved again and again. At last the people were quiet, and she began to speak. She told something about her work as a nurse in the army camps, but she talked more about the needs of the soldiers who were still in hospitals. When she finished, there was a long applause. Then again the audience rose and stood until she had left the stage. They couldn't do enough to show how much they loved and respected her. President of American Red Cross. 15 years later, in 1882, another great crowd of people was in the same hall in Washington, D.C., to hear Miss Clara Barton speak again. Again, she was the most famous woman in the United States. Again, she had started something that had never been done before by anyone, man or woman, in this country. She had founded the Red Cross in America. Everyone in the crowded hall was talking about this. They all knew that Miss Barton had worked for years to get this country to join the International Red Cross. It had been established in Europe 20 years before, but America had been slow to join. Many officials didn't see the need for a Red Cross chapter here. "We won't have another war in this country," they said. "It is impossible." Miss Barton didn't agree with them. She remembered the Civil War too well. "There will be other wars," she said, "and we must be ready to take care of the soldiers who are wounded." She went to the White House to talk with President Hayes about the Red Cross. Later on, she went to see President Garfield. Still later, she talked with President Arthur. She talked with senators and representatives. She made public speeches in all parts of the country. At last, under President Arthur, the United States signed the treaty with 16 other countries. Now our country was a member of the International Red Cross. That being an organization all over the world that provides care to wounded soldiers that are hurt during the war. This new chapter, the American Red Cross, had made Miss Barton its first president. The meeting tonight was in her honor. Now the officers of the Red Cross were coming onto the stage, and people began to applaud the woman who was responsible for this treaty. There was no need to tell the audience which person on stage was Miss Barton. They had seen her picture many times in the newspapers recently. Her hair was gray now, but her dark eyes were as bright as ever. She was still small and slender. There was a thunder of applause when the people saw her. Everyone stood, and hundreds of voices cheered her. The gray-haired lady bowed and smiled and waved her hand. Again and again she tried to speak, but the applause went on and on. At last there was quiet, and she began to speak to them. Everyone listened intently. She said this Red Cross treaty among nations was a great and noble deed. Her heart was singing with happiness because her own country had now put its seal on the treaty. She told them that the Red Cross could serve in time of peace as well as during a war. There were only a few Red Cross rules, she explained. The most important was that all men who were wounded in war would be cared for. It would not matter whether they were friends or enemies, black, white, yellow, or red. The next most important rule was that no Red Cross workers, doctors, or nurses could be captured or put in prison by the enemy. The American chapter has now added one more rule for the United States, Miss Barton said. It will help whenever there is a fire, flood, cyclone, hurricane, earthquake, or other disaster where it can be of use. It will go also wherever there is an epidemic, such as yellow fever, typhus, or smallpox, either in this country or in any other country. It will be ready to serve whenever it can relieve human suffering. The homeless and the sick will be given shelter, medicine, food, and clothing, regardless of their ability to pay. All of this aid will be free. Not one sufferer will be asked to pay a penny. The money for all this will be given by those who are able to help. The fortunate will aid the unfortunate. When there is peace, we will train volunteer workers who can care for the wounded in time of war. We will prepare medical supplies to be ready when they are needed. Will you help us? Yes, yes, shouted many people. We will have trained people ready to go immediately to a place where there is a flood, a fire, a tornado, or any other disaster. We will provide food and temporary shelter for all those unfortunate men, women, and children who are left homeless and hungry. We will have supplies ready to help those who are hurt or sick. We will give immediately help when there is an epidemic. Will you help us? Yes, yes, shouted the people. I myself am serving without pay, and so are these officers. Our only thought is to make the American Red Cross a success. Will you help us? Yes, yes, cried the audience. Then they stood again and applauded until Miss Barton left the stage. There has never been anyone like her in the world, said an old man. Never, never, said all who heard.